Welcome back to the Arise Exchange, right here on Arise News. South African markets, your exchange over in Johannesburg, the most capitalized market in Africa, fell below $1 trillion, about 900 billion or so. And 74,213, 14 basis points to the good. Over in Lusaka in Zambia, as of Thursday, they were up by 7 basis points, or flat. In Botswana, 9,001 points. Beautiful Mauritius, got to go vacation here one day. 5 basis points into the bearish zone. 2,051 points is when it closed. And in Zambia, Zimbabwe, where they keep coming up with new things to do to save their exchange rates, well, they're down by 117 basis points. So that's what we're seeing over in the Southern African markets. So speaking of the Southern African markets, Rand Merchant Bank, one of Africa's biggest investment banks, headquartered in South Africa, on Thursday hosted a panel of discussants on the country's latest budget for 2024-2025. The RMB Budget Review Forum was headlined by South Africa's Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, Chief Economist at RMB, and 2 other speakers.
In the lead up to every budget, whether you look at whatever newspaper headlines, the nuance or some of the tropes that are thrown out there is that this is going to be the most difficult budget. The minister is on a tough balancing act, walking a tightrope, and various other things. In the lead up to this one, does it get difficult each year, or do you believe that each budget becomes difficult based on external circumstances and some of the internal things happening within the economy?
This year was a bit tough. When I came in, I had the benefit of the commodity boom to some extent. And 2021-22, we came with a 200 billion rand revenue barrel. So nice things we could find, all the SRDs and other things. As we entered the 23-24 financial year, things became tough. One of the things we didn't have money for was the SRD. 36 billion. First quarter 2023, revenue shortfall. Intensive load shedding, Transnet logistics. I'm just giving an example. I'm told by the mining industry that the last time they were below 60 or so tons, 60 million tons per annum on Richards Bay was in 1996. Right through there with about 77 million tons. Last year, it was below 50, about 40-something million tons. Now, what that tells you is that the revenue loss was massive for us in that first quarter. So we're coming to this financial year already. You will see we make the point that the revenue shortfall was about 56 billion rand. We're already entering this year from a tougher position. That's why in the medium-term budget policy, we had to make certain massive adjustment and budget cuts. So we entered this planning for this budget. We're in that very difficult environment.
They are in line with our expectations. The good thing is Treasury uses the same numbers we use. They don't have, to a large extent, outside of public sector data. Data is very transparent, which is a good thing. So growth expectations of 1.2, 1.3, if you look at consensus, Treasury is 1.3 for this year. For the next 2 years, you could say an average of 1.6, 1.7. It's a plausible expectations, which is one of the big change that we saw over the last 3 years, where Treasury's forecast has been much more realistic as compared to the decade 2019, where forecast tended to be over-optimistic, resulting in over-budgeting, and following that, spending would continue to balloon. So realistic forecasts. The risks, obviously, are the things that the minister spoke about. It's your logistics. If we continue to have the issues that we have with Transnet, that hampers the mining sector's production. It's again load shedding. At least we have had significant investments by private companies with the incentive that was provided to invest in solar energy. It does mitigate, but it doesn't solve for base load. That remains a big risk. Globally, we don't know what's going to happen with the US elections. Given how government has communicated its foreign policy, we don't know how Donald Trump 2.0 is going to respond to that. That's a potential risk from a trade perspective. The Middle East issues continue to be a risk as well. These are the things that we know.
Yes.
But there are also things that we might not know that might come either because of decisions that we don't implement. I have to say, the one other thing that is in the budget, which is sneaked through, but not explicitly, have to do with an unallocated spending that looks like 2 years more of an SRD grant beyond March 2025. Maybe we can get a little bit of an explanation, because then the quantums just looks like it's an SRD grant. But we can hear National Treasury's response on as far as that is concerned.
We would like to see the grant coming to an end in March 2025. That's our wish. We had an interesting debate with my DG. I said we must distinguish between our wish and reality. Reality is that there's a lot of movement, social, particularly the NGO movement, which is campaigning for what they call basic income grant. And that thing is appealing in a number of appealing to a number of political parties and politicians. Now, that's where your difficulty is that there's that movement. We've got to say, our view is that given the fiscal space and the demands for health, for everything else, if you continue with it, you may have to find a new source of revenue, which means taxing. But there's a debate about NHI, which may also require a new form of taxing. And there's a limit in how far you can tax people, and so on. So we disagree with a number of people on some of these things, but as I'm saying, we're walking that tightrope.
The minister is right. I think we have been squeezed in all sorts of forms. All sorts of taxes are potentially at their maximum as far as they can go. And even not adjusting the tax brackets is in itself a further squeeze because there isn't an inflationary increase, So you receive an inflationary increase, but it does not mean much. In some cases, you're potentially worse off. And that forces the government to think very creatively about how do you collect differently. And hence, the Revenue Service has to look at how do they widen the tax base, how do they improve compliance, how do they use technology for administrative efficiency. And that's where they really have to focus, because there isn't much more you can really squeeze. And even looking at the 15% minimum global tax, then in itself will require corporates to invest in technology, in systems to be able to comply with that. So that's even further squeezing a place that's already completely out. So it's not an easy space to be in. It's definitely a very difficult situation we're in, and hence creativity is required here from all sides, because we're in a very tight spot. And potentially that's why there wasn't much mention around NHI, because some kind of funding has to come from somewhere. So where do you get it from? At this, given where we are at the moment, it's a very difficult space to be in.
When we talk about this global minimum corporate tax of 15%, how should we view it, and perhaps the aim from a tax perspective?
So this came from the OECD in trying to help prevent tax-based erosion, especially in the lower income tax jurisdictions, where multinationals are seen to be transporting their funds into that space. And so what this does is that it forces all jurisdictions to pay a minimum tax, and that tax will be paid in that jurisdiction. And the difficulty with this is that it's not as simple as it sounds, that, okay, everybody pay minimum 15% tax, because if you think about it, jurisdictions all have their own tax laws. So you almost have to find a way of how do you compare apples to apples in levying this 15% minimum tax. So if you think about it, how do you make an apple sitting in the UK look like an apple sitting in South Africa, knowing that they're not getting the same sun, the same water, the same ground to grow on, you know? So it's a very complex, it's an extremely complex tax. And being in an environment where I've got exposure to how it's been implemented in other jurisdictions, I know how complex it is. So it's not as simple as it sounds, that it is just easy 15% and just levy it. So it's going to, the devil is going to be in the detail. We do have legislation that does already try and cater for ensuring that there is, to minimize tax-based erosion.